Dear participants of the Financiers Congress, our first plenary session is devoted to macroeconomic policy in developing the financial sector of Kazakhstan. Allow me to introduce our speakers. Today we have the Minister of Finance, Yerulan Zhamaubayev, the First Vice Minister of the National Economy, Timur Zhaksylykov, the Deputy Chairman of the National Bank, Akylzhan Baimagambetov, the Chairman of the Board of Halyk Bank, Umut Shayakhmetova, and Chairman of the Board of KZ, Umut. Mr. Timur Mikeshevich, let's start with the economic agenda of the government. The pandemic and the crisis of 2020 have become the most significant for Kazakhstan, and the rapid measures of support from the government, which amounted to 6.3 trillion Tenge, or 9% of the GDP, have allowed to ease the harm to the economy. And this has helped the economy recover, and the growth is right now 3.5%. But still, in spite of the growing vaccination rates, we still have new strains of virus. And apart from that, it's expected that the measures on economic growth will aid the situation. And the macroeconomic stability issue has been actualized, and we're seeing that the government focuses on reforms as well. The new plan of development of Kazakhstan until 2025, there were national projects confirmed where we've identified the main priorities for the economy for the midterm. Timur Mikeshevich, is it now time to step away from short-term measures, and what do we need to do in order to shift to long-term economic growth? Thank you very much, Madina, for the question. I'd like to start my answer by reminding you that since the beginning of the pandemic, we definitely have implemented several packages of anti-crisis measures aimed mainly at supporting the income of the population, employment, supporting business and internal demand, and anti-pandemic measures. And we use such tools as tax stimuluses, deregulation, expanding concessionary lending, and by April of this year we've arrived at a positive growth zone, 3.5% year to date, and we're expecting 3.7, 3.8 to have at the end of the year. Now, we have a growth against the background of an improvement of the global economic situation. Demand is on the rise, supply is growing, logistical ties are being recovered, and prices have increased for oil and gas. And across the world, as it was already mentioned before me, inflation is growing. Kazakhstan also, the growth of inflation is tied to the gaps, the pandemic gaps between supply and demand, and also the interventions done by the countries to stimulate demand. And the evident answer to the growth of inflation is a more harsh lending policy, and that's a global trend. Now, replying to your question, I would like to mention the following: that an exit from the anti-crisis paradigm demands a transition stage of preparing for the post-crisis stage. And for this reason, the government will act gradually, taking into account the pandemic situation. I'd like to remind that still, in spite of the improvement, there are 3 regions in the red zone. Neighbor in Russia, where we have another wave currently. And now, about the key measures on shifting to sustainable economic growth, which, as you correctly mentioned, were defined in the National Plan of Development until 2025 and in the recently adopted national projects. I'd like to single out 5, in my opinion, key areas, which first is ensuring a growth of investments. The construction of infrastructure, developing human capital, a focus on digital solutions and a shift to a digital economy, and also the development of competition deregulation and a shift to a new regulatory policy for business. And for each of these areas, I'd like to talk about them specifically. To incentivize investments, measures will be taken to protect the rights of investors, to improve the infrastructure, and to improve the quality of the regulation of investment activity. For investors who are implementing significant projects for the economy, we will provide special conditions and also concessionary environment within the framework of the AFC. In the foundation for the creation of a favorable investment climate will be the support of a macroeconomic, fiscal, and financial stability, also sticking within the inflation corridor. The investment policies will be implemented within our current sector policies, including ensuring growth of the processing sector. And in the processing sector, we have planned an implementation of 500 projects, approximately, including large projects in oil, gas, and chemistry. In the APK sphere, we will have also large projects for the production and the processing of agricultural products, and we would like to get investments up to the level of 30% by 2025. And secondly, developing infrastructure, which is also a very important key area, especially the transport and logistics infrastructure and the housing and utilities infrastructure. And key efforts will be aimed at improving the infrastructure's connectivity between the regions, the improving of the transit potential of the country, and creating a national commodity transit system. Also, human capital, improving the advanced training based on dual education programs, creating academic excellence centers, also a national qualification body. In terms of digitization of the economy sectors, before me this was also mentioned, and Mr. Baghdad, who is here at the session, can tell us better than me about that. But overall, I'd like to say that the focus on a digital transformation on various areas of our life is one of the measures that in the long term will help us shift to a sustainable economic growth. And fifth, I'd like to note that maybe a key area also is a competitive policy of deregulation and a new regulation policy. We will be focusing on using soft law tools and reducing government procurement and privatization of government property. In terms of the regulatory policy, we'll be doing a review of the mandatory regulatory requirements and creating a registry of mandatory regulatory requirements. We've already prepared a draft law for the new regulation policy. It's already passed through the first reading in our Majlis, and we're expecting that by the end of the year. We hope that by the end of the year this law will be approved. Now, what this will enable the business to do, I'd like to give one example. Now, before the law is approved, we've already started doing a review of the regulatory requirements in the pilot spheres. In public catering, for example, we've identified 67 facilities where they have 1,700 regulatory requirements, and 48% of those requirements are not in line with the requirements of the new regulatory policy, and they should be either reviewed or canceled. And thus, we will implement the regulatory guillotine principle, and this will be implemented in 2023 and 2022. Now, I'd like to also mention that this draft law also stipulates for one in, two out principle that every new regulatory mandatory requirement that is implemented should be followed by the cancellation of 2 active ones in that same sphere of regulation. Now, hopefully, I've been able to answer your question. Not going to take up more time. Thank you very much, Mr. Timur. Now, inflation targeting and budget rules are 2 foundations of economic stability. And Kazakhstan has always had a healthy level of government debt, but due to the anti-crisis package, we've seen that there has been a big stress on the budget, and the anti-crisis package was funded by the national fund, from which the allocations have grown significantly, and this year 4.5 trillion tenge have been allocated from national fund again. And these financial measures have led to a budget deficit of 3.1% and a growth of oil deficit up to 2.7%, and the government debt has went up to 29% of the GDP, although it is still at quite a low and safe level, and thus, due to the expansion of support measures, the budget space is shrinking, which is needed for future expenses. And similar trends we're seeing in many countries of the world as a result of support measures. And the head of state has ordered the government to introduce a counter-cyclical rule. And the government is working on a new concept of managing government finance up until 2030. Mr. Yerulan Kenjibekovich, could you please tell us what is planned to increase the balance of government finance? What work is done by the Ministry of Finance? Dear colleagues, and dear Congress participants, firstly, I'd like to thank you for inviting me to participate in this Congress and in this session, especially Mr. Yerulan Askarbekovich. I personally accepted his invitation, and here we've got some really well-known financiers of here. These are our teachers, our leaders. I'm really happy to see you. We all need these congresses, and there's a lot of issues to be discussed. I congratulate you on the 30th anniversary of our independence, and I'll just have a few slides, if I may. Slide number 2, please. It's the last year was pretty difficult. Everybody knows that. Now, to support the economy, many countries were forced to increase their budget deficit and to increase government debt. Now, as we can see on the slide, pretty much all the countries face this issue. We have a list of examples here. In Russia, as you can see, in 2019, the budget deficit there was a surplus, and now it's at about 3% deficit. In Turkey, the budget deficit grew twice. In Brazil, by 3 times. In Kazakhstan, of course, also joined this list, and the budget deficit exceeded 3%. We do understand that this is not a critical situation, but and the government debt has also grown, but government debt, as Madina said, is at a safe level currently. International experts also agree with that, and we have an IMF mission here, and they also say that it's not just at a safe level, but it's at a comfortable level. Yes, last year we had to spend significant funds on anti-crisis measures, and we've got transfers allocated from the National Fund. Mr. Timur has also mentioned that. Now, undoubtedly, a trend like this has to be turned around, and we need to work on the income part of the budget. Next slide. Now, the economy is recovering, already 3.5% of the GDP, and we're expecting 3.8% growth. And we're already seeing the budget for the 3 years, and in the next year we will be reducing the number of transfers from the fund. all the funds. The guaranteed transfers from the national fund will be reduced next year by 300 billion tenge, and the targeted transfers this year was 1.9 trillion tenge. Next year it will be only 550 billion tenge. It will be reduced further.
Thus, we see that the oil revenues into the budget will get down. At the same time, we will be seeing an increase in the share of non-petroleum revenue. And by 2024, this share will be 71%. Thus, we are transiting to the counter-cyclical budget rule, and this allows us, starting next year, to not to spend the assets of the national fund. This will also allow us to reduce dependence on the budget on the fund, and also strengthen the saving function of the national fund. When developing the 3-year period for 23-25, this rule will be taken into account and implemented. Next slide, please. So it's understood that in these conditions we need to increase the revenue part of our budget as tasked by our president. So we showed it in broad terms how we are going to achieve this. First of all, we need to decrease the shadow economy. According to official data, this level is about 20% shadow economy, and our priority task now is to decrease it to 15% as a minimum. So to the level of OECD countries, and starting this year we will start implementing the universal income declaration. We have major objectives on modernizing the customs infrastructure. All main customs posts will be modernized, 9 auto and 1 railroad customs posts. Also, the improvement of tax and customs administration have allowed us to receive over 2 billion tenge into the budget. And a couple of words about the concept of finance management. Up to this time, we didn't have a unified document on state management of finance. Now this concept, the National Fund has its own concept on effective planning and use of budget funds. There was no unified document, but now we are consolidating all this. We will develop clear-cut rules. In all areas there will be a set of fiscal rules, and this integrated approach will promote fiscal discipline as well as the financial state of the country in general. My next question will be addressed to Akylzhan Baimagambetov from National Bank of Kazakhstan. Kazakhstan National Bank in 2021 was on the front line of combating the crisis. The bank also launched some preferential loans, and these measures supported the business and population. But in 2021 we are seeing a high rise of inflation and inflation expectations. Inflation is growing not only in Kazakhstan but throughout the world, and the cited reasons are soft monetary policy, but also interruptions in the supply chains. Many experts think this inflationary growth will be short-term. However, so National Bank is facing a very difficult task. Akylzhan Malikovich, what monetary policy will be implemented by National Bank? How should the coordination of the fiscal policy be implemented? Thank you for your question. I will start with our current monetary policy with the inflation. Indeed, in the last half year, we have seen a growth in inflation from 7% to 8.9%, at currently 8.9%. The highest surge was observed in the summer months. This was a non-characteristic because the food prices get low in this time, so we didn't have the seasonal price reduction for food. So given the global food price growth, we also have some local inflation, and the food inflation has achieved two digits at now 11.1%. So, and we have come down from the peak in September, 11.5%, and we are tightly observing the situation because the food price growth makes about half contribution to the whole inflation. It's one of the most important factors. So there are also two other components, non-food inflation and paid services. Here we also see some important acceleration. On the one hand, we see some disbalances. A good example is the petroleum market, which has led to the growth of diesel by 16.6 in the last month, and more than 24% in the last 1 year. This is growth level for diesel. Also, we cannot disregard the recovery of demand in the economy. Last year, because of lockdowns, the demand was suppressed, but starting second quarter of this year, we see a quite different situation. We see a recovery of the Kazakh economy, which leads to the increase of consumer activity. So we see a growth in the nominal and real income. We see growth in lending, also the continuing fiscal stimuli. As a result, the rise in the demand, the imports are also redistributing. The last statistics in the last 9 months, we see that the consumer imports have grown by 21.4%. And this accounts for $1.5 billion US. So we cannot say that this is related to the low base. Last year, the consumer demand also grew, but it grew to by about 4.6% compared to 2019. So talking about the monetary policy, we see a trend in demand growth. We see that the last 3 sessions we have been raising the base rate. So we have been acting very cautiously, but we have been raising the base the base rate by 25 points in each of our sessions, and we have 3 sessions. And we see that next year it will be realistic to achieve the upper ceiling of the corridor, 4.6%. In October, the quantified assessment for inflation is quite high, 10.3%, and this is what our actions are focused on. From the standpoint of our further activities jointly with the government, in our panel discussion we have coordination, and this is aimed at reducing inflationary pressure. This is very important midterm, and our bank jointly with AFK and the government, we have had several initiatives that we're implementing. The National Bank intends to complete funding some anti-crisis programs this year. The other programs will be wrapped up. According to our plan, this will be done in 23-25, but I think we will be able to do it earlier. An important factor in stabilizing the microfinancial policy is to implement the budget rule. The parameters of the rule itself are being actively discussed with the government, and I will introduce you to the perspective of the National Bank. There will be two major elements. The first anchor will be the price of oil, which will be set in a conservative way, and based on it we will determine the transfers from the national fund to the Republican budget. If we talk about technically the cutoff price, we will calculate percentiles and standard deviations so that we calculate oil prices not at the mean level but from the conservative point of view. In good years we will spend less from the national fund, and the second important element, as we see it, is to determine the upper limit of inflation growth growth rate of budgetary funds. If we take an example, long term, in the 10 years, the average economic growth was 3.5%. The inflation target, if we talk about 2023, 4.5, 3.4% in midterm, then the growth of state funds expenditure should not exceed 7 to 8%. We don't have a formula yet. We are still discussing and coordinating it. But our vision of the National Bank is like this. I don't think I will dwell on the effects of the counter-cyclic measures and permanent transfer from the national funds keeps national expenditure high. This creates new inflation pressure. Therefore, in our opinion, the implementation of the rule will allow us to reduce the effect of the budget from the commodity cycle, will help stabilize the inflationary impulse, and will help attract investment. If we follow these rules, if we save more national fund assets, the minister has already said that the rule will be used in the next year for the budget process when determining the state budget for 2023 and subsequent years. This will be captured in the concept of state finance management. Another important element of our future monetary policy in coordinating our macroeconomic policy and in the monetary policy is the intent of the government to transit to roadmap. So this is about eliminating distortions of credits, of loans. This will allow us to address one of the issues related to the balance of state expenditure. On the other hand, this will allow us to address money cost distortions. This is mostly of interest to the bankers, I guess, and this will aid competition both in the financial market and in business. And in conclusion, to reduce inflationary pressure, we need to coordinate macroeconomic policy. This includes monetary and fiscal. This was captured in our strategy of our monetary policy until 2020. And the main platform for this, we see a trilateral agreement between government, bank, and the agency. This is a format that we are having from recent times. And thank you. I hope I answered your question. Thank you very much. Talking about macroeconomic policy to financial market in 2021 became a pivot year for the financial sector, given the budget consolidation plans of the government, given the plans to withdraw the national bank from support policies. I think the financial market's role will grow. In the financial market, we have seen a growth of financial liquidity, and banks, in spite of the crisis, continued growing their credit portfolios. They transformed their strategies, their business strategies. However, there are certain risks, there are certain imbalances in consumer lending in favor of mortgage lending. And how can we ensure accessibility of loans for the growth of our economy based on market principles? And Umut Bolothanovna, what prospects for the banking sector development do you see? What do we need to do to ensure balanced growth in economy lending? Well, first of all, I would like to congratulate everybody on the professional holiday, on the day of Financiers. I wish you good health. We are in the middle of another challenge, and every year seems to offer a different challenge. And I hope we will get through the ordeals that we have to go through. You're asking questions about the role of the financial sector and how big or how big it is getting, and how it affects the banking business transformation. If we talk about Halyk Bank, we are indeed the largest bank, and we are present in all sectors. We finance all areas, major companies, national companies, foreign companies, middle-sized companies, SMEs, and retail. Moreover, we are participating in the securities market and working on a daily basis. We see development in different regions. We see the situation throughout the economy. And what I hear today, the measures that are going to be implemented, the inflation targeting by National Bank, the privatization, deregulation, good investment climate. However, I feel there is nothing new in this. We have been hearing about all this for the last 5 years. Let's try to understand why the situation is developing the way it is. There are some external factors due to pandemic. There are also some internal factors that we need to work on more effectively. If we talk about the monetary policy, the bankers don't always understand quite well how the oil price is affecting the exchange rate of Tenge, and how ruble, we see that that the exchange rate is not very volatile, and external factors are not affecting the exchange rate quite significantly. We see that Tenge is becoming cheaper to ruble. However, the oil price is growing.
Another big topic was the base rate, and I guess it remains that in spite of the development in the presence of big liquidity in the banking sector, the base rate is reacting not as flexibly and maybe not as radically as we're seeing it happen on the global markets and in our closest neighbors. And what does that lead to, and how does that impact the banking sector and the lending to the economy? Now, firstly, I'm emphasizing once again, we have a large liquidity. It went up to even 5 trillion at some point. It's now 4 trillion from the side of the National Bank. The role of lending in the economy has dropped in relation to the GDP from 67% in 2007. Now it's only 21%. And a breakthrough that happened in 2021 is that out of this 21% portfolio in relation to the GDP, a bigger share of loans are issued to physical entities, mortgages, and the role of banks in lending in the economy in relation to the GDP has dropped down to 10%. So it's a record low number. If we look at our neighboring Russia, these numbers there are growing and have already amounted to 60% in relation to the GDP. And that's the dynamic of the recent years in spite of the sanction situation. So what's happening? Why are banks not lending in the economy? We hear a lot of criticism that we give out consumer loans. Yes, the situation is such. It's because we have an internal problem with our borrowers, with companies that are ready to modernize, to expand. We give benefits to external investors, but I guess we need the same type of benefits for internal investors too. I guess we have them, but still, why is this demand not on market conditions? We do understand that there are issues, and in terms of the last year, there was the issue of demand and supplies and deliveries, but in the 2 or 3 years before that, when the situation was favorable, still this demand for loans and investments into expanding production capacities we're not seeing. There are several factors. The competitiveness of our economy compared to Russia, where we are importing more Russian goods and Kazakhstani producers can't compete. So what's happening? In the past 2 years, when the base rates in Russia were very low, at around the level of 4.25%, there was an arbitrage happening. So it was cheaper to loan in rubles in Russia than here in Kazakhstan, with our base rate being over 9%. And so even in lending, we're seeing a more debt burden on our Kazakhstani borrowers as compared to the Russian ones. And we're seeing that also it takes a reflection in rublization of the economy. If before we had a dollarization, now we have a rublization, and the trading in rubles has gone up on the stock exchange 3 times. If we're talking about loans, we're also seeing a growth of funding from Russian banks in rubles of our Kazakhstani borrowers. Now, even if the Ministry of Finance borrows in rubles, last year we saw cases like that. So it just emphasizes once again that funding in rubles, that really wasn't to the benefit of our manufacturers and our borrowers. Now the rates are evening out a bit. You've seen that in Russia, the base rate went up to over 3%, and now that gap, that arbitrage, is decreasing. So hopefully this will be more favorably impacting the competitiveness of our Kazakhstani borrowers and manufacturers in terms of lending. Also, a big issue is import replacement. I think that's something that needs to be developed. The agricultural sector is also a big topic. I believe we do have a big potential of developing that, where banks would, with pleasure, lend to if there was kind of a clear policy on developing the agricultural sector. And that's about lending to the economy. Now, overall, I'd like to say for the consumer loans, there was a pivotal moment when 53% of the total portfolio are physical entity borrowers currently, and the trend is growing and it will keep growing, especially when the government has these programs for MFI funding. On the one hand, we're saying, let's intensify the requirements and demand more capital, but still we give cheap money for this funding. And we've been saying for a long time that the government needs to exit government support programs massively, because consumer loans are, at the end of the day, money that is spent on import. So they're mostly buying imported goods. With our government money, we're funding other countries' economies. Our neighbor Russia, and all of these other external markets. And now, in our nearest neighbor state, Uzbekistan, where we also work, you can only get a consumer loan on a targeted program if the customer is buying a product produced in Uzbekistan. But we do know that they produce their own cars, that they produce household appliances. And so you can get a consumer loan if you buy a locally made refrigerator or a TV or a car. But if you're trying to buy imported products, then these consumer loans will not be issued. So there's a lot of these tools that are targeted and specific. We shouldn't ban consumer loans. You need them. You can't just say we're not funding that anymore. We have to be balanced about this. And the coefficient of debt burden, which is being implemented, I think it's a good initiative, but there's official income, but there's also unofficial income that a population has. And bankers can probably see more if they look at the transfers and turnovers. The official statistics don't show as much. A good initiative from the Ministry of Finance is that they're implementing taxation of mobile transfers for P2P transfers from physical entity to physical entity, but inside that it's actually a business transaction flow. And this should be disclosed, and here you'll have more taxes and you have more transparency on the income of the population and of the SMEs. I'm thinking that for the consumer loans, I'd like to say there is a trend, but we can't just be elevating the requirements. We need to be more balanced in our approach. Overall, the banking sector, Madina, you said it right, has recovered. The situation in terms of financial stability is stable. We are feeling comfortable. The banks have liquidity. They have capital. We have customers. Main thing you have to do is choose the right business model. It's very important for us. What we're all doing is to transform to digital, transform the digital services for our clients, because our clients are very mobile, which is great. Our customers are very picky and they're very demanding, which I think is good. Nowadays, the market is on the customer's side. The market nowadays is enabling the customer to demand, and banks and other financial institutions have to adapt and have to build up cheaper and more convenient services for the customers. So competition creates this great environment when the consumer wins in the end. And I'd like to also say that if there is a task of lending, and the government, I think, has the task of lending in terms of regulation on collateral, in terms of regulating borrowers and their collateral, you have to take a balanced approach to that and not be too emotional about some negative things that have happened recently. When the borrower is in the wrong, they don't want to return the money. They've used the money. And unfortunately, the legislation is on the side of such a borrower. So there should be pro-creditor regulation pro-lender regulation. Everywhere in the world, they stick to that. When they have pro-lender regulation. It's not like you borrow the money, you don't return it, and after 90 days you don't have to return it at all. And we'll just be promoting such behavior, and then sooner or later we'll have to bail out another bank because the customers can just not return the money and nothing will happen. And that's probably what I wanted to say mainly. Thank you very much, Ms. Umut. Now my last question, Mr. Mikhail, is to you. The financial sector is the flagship of using digital technology, and today we have an ecosystem transformation of banks. Kaspi.kz has proved that with their IPO, becoming the company with the biggest capitalization in Kazakhstan. But thanks to with these conveniences, also risks come rise for the consumers of these services. In the ecosystem that replaced traditional banks mean that regulation can also not remain inert, and this is why we also have the task to find the balance between regulation and freedom to further develop the financial center. Mr. Lamtadze, what systemic risks do you see considering the quick permeation of banks into fintech, and how do you see the regulation of the system? Thank you, Ms. Madina. Good day, colleagues. I congratulate you on the holidays, the upcoming holidays, mainly the 30th anniversary of the independence of the country in a professional, holiday. I'm not a financier, so I agree that the 30th anniversary of independence is probably the main holiday, at least for me. So in terms of the dynamic of Kazakhstan's development, it's quite clear that Kazakhstan has made an unprecedented leap in innovation and digitization in creating fintech products. And these products are improving the life of Kazakhstanis nowadays and right now. And the driver of innovation is Kaspi.kz. And it's an example and a role model, not only within the country in Kazakhstan, but also in the global arena. If we look at capitalization, Kaspi is one of the biggest fintech companies in the world. It was created in Kazakhstan. And all of the developments are done by us, our team. It's all done in Kazakhstan. And as a result of our IPO, in that communication that we have here with the investors in global markets, of course, we were able to increase the investment attractiveness of the country. So investors that Kaspi has have never invested before into Kazakhstan. And now through us, our investors, largest technology fund, prestigious ones, American investment funds, pension funds. Now, if we're talking about developing the fintech industry, several years ago, nobody could imagine that something like that would be possible in Kazakhstan. And as of today, look at any financial institution. Everybody's innovating. Everybody's doing digitization. 2 or 3 years ago, nobody was doing that. Now everybody's jumped to digitization, and for everyone, that's an important priority. And of course, the infrastructure that's being created by the National Bank with the support of the regulator also facilitates and fosters this innovation in terms of opening accounts online for Kazakhstanis, which was super relevant, especially during the pandemic, when online opening accounts helped receive social benefits and assistance by the population. And also we're doing a lot of work with the government bodies, Ministry of Digitization, Ministry of Finance, Ministry of Internal Affairs. And the biggest example is a re-registration of car ownership. Nowhere in the world they have that. Every third car is re-registered within the mobile app, and we believe, and it's pretty evident, that on the one hand, technology and innovation improve the lives of Kazakhstanis and improve their living quality. On the other hand, we're also seeing that the competitiveness of the country is really improving. Nobody carries cash. Everybody buys delivery nowadays. They pay taxes online. They pay their utilities online without a fee. And every financial institution has that almost. So there's a great potential for development. And of course, for that, to support that development, it would be really great to change the regulation also. So if we when we communicate with the colleagues, the feedback is that regulation is too harsh and it inhibits development and creation of innovative services. And based on that, at least 3 things can be done specific. Like first is to give an opportunity to financial institutions to acquire assets that will help them develop their business. Like the Halyk Bank wants to privatize, participate in privatization of Kazpost, purchase mobile operators. So assets, maybe commercial banks will want to buy some assets, and this will help expand their business and create innovative services. Of course, you need to be careful here because these acquisitions are made using the funds of our customers. So second thing is an open banking platform so that everybody would have access to banking information, our customers. This will also help us create innovative services. This will give equal access to many players to customer information. This will increase competition. And already now everybody's creating competitive products, but they'll be doing that even faster. And it'll make financial services more accessible for the citizens. Open API of the banking platform, that's really great, but it's time to do something about that. And the third regulation area is, maybe you won't agree, but to give tech companies an opportunity to also get access to the API and to banking information. Local tech companies, international tech companies, and even foreign financial institutions. I mean, what are we afraid of? Why is Kazakhstan's banking sector afraid of competing with foreign banks and tech companies? We need to enable them access to the Kazakhstani market. That will make it better for the consumer. That is better for competitiveness. I think now we're all doing digitization. If we have foreign tech companies and financial institutes coming in, we'll be developing even faster. That's great. Competitiveness is great. So these 3 things we need to give an opportunity to the banks to buy assets, and that's already in process. We just need to speed it up, make another banking platform so that the players have access in the open API. And also third, to give foreign financial companies, why not, right? Give them access to the Kazakhstani market so that innovations can develop even faster and competitiveness is even more, and the consumer will win in the end. Kaspi is not afraid of competition, but we know some of our colleagues are against foreign companies coming in the market. Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Mr. Lamtazi. Actually, the time of our session is about to be out, so is there a question? There's a question. I just wanted to use this opportunity. I'd just like to thank the speakers, and the question is not only to my colleague from Nur Sultan, we see a lot and we actively socialize, and they try to share our agenda. So the main question, Ms. Umut is a person who is not only the most critical to her work and to us, but she's also probably a big expert of the banking sector, because I'm a veteran of the system. Yes, and she's seen many chairmen of the National Bank, and she's seen the government, and we haven't offered so much innovation throughout the past 5 years. But it's also about the execution. It's also about how we implement all this. It's clear that the past 2 years, the pandemic has really changed our plans. Maybe we've become more organized finally, because we believe that the time gap was always big, and we can afford to do something tomorrow if we don't do it today. But the basic issues that we're touching upon, the development of the financial sector and giving it the role of the initial market driver through lending to the economy, it's always been relevant, and it still is relevant. Unfortunately, now since 2015, the 6 months, our average yearly inflation is more than 7.5%. And everything that was done with our main partner, that was anchoring in inflation. I understand that there are disbalances and logistics chains are being broken up. And so we are in evolution mode. And I'm quite happy that the government and the head of the government are focusing on issues of pricing as well, because when they implemented a new budget rule, the participation of the national bank, the economy needs new funds. It needs new inputs, and that the issue of implementation is only then that, considering the current leverage that physical entities and legal entities have for new money that should be in the economy, we need an environment that should be competitive. And I'm not talking about the arbitrage that we have now, which became less, but the issues. Of course, borrowers always look for better conditions.
But I would like to say that issues related to rates, to base rates, and for your marginality has always been relevant. Who is making what? This year, to be honest, starting from the start of this year, we allocated 3.8 trillion tenge. There is a direct correlation. Bank funds have flown into the banks. There is a lot of liquidity in the bank, and we are supporting the banks. But I would like to say that the evolution itself and the achieving inflationary targeting depends on what we do. We still have questions whether we will have enough space for you to assume risks and start lending. There is a limited number of borrowers in the country, and we are competing for them. Same relates to consumer loaning. There have been a lot of questions about the Akylzhan. This is a common problem of price stability. The national bank sticks to its mandate, but monetary and non-monetary factors are disbalanced. We want the monetary part to be balanced. We are talking about reducing import dependency, food safety, and questions related to the quality of investors that are to come. Kazakhstan is not going to produce everything, but we want to find our niches in the global logistic chains. For the first time, our achievement is to coordinate our policies with the government, and the question is not about the format of the agreement. The question is about what we want to achieve. Unfortunately, we will have to to bear with things. We cannot say that 2022 will be great, but in the midterm, as our president has supported, we have set an ambitious goal of 3.4%. But the question is, the financial sector is on the end. I want the financial sector not only to capitalize at the expense of the incomes. So we need to work with the borrowers. We want to work on the distressed assets, because AQR and things that we detected with you, they still remain. So it relates both to large institutions and to mid-sized and small institutions. And I think this is our common task, what we are going to do. Thank you once again. Our atmosphere is a bit different in Almaty. But I would like to thank you to Nur-Sultan people for telling us what we need to do. I also think that this should be only coordinated work with the government, because when the government overwhelms us with money and the national banks wants to kind of sterilize it, it's not the right thing. You have said the targets. However, the Minister of Finance securities are issued with the income of over 10% and the curve is going up. This is also a signal to the market. So it is either that we will have a bigger margin. Inflation is in the basis of everything that we were talking about. And the investment from Halyk Bank, this is always relevant. And people will be just happy. The Minister of Finance will be just happy to be, receiving security income, bond income at a higher rate. To sum it up, in 2020, in joint effort from different parties, the crisis has been managed, but we still have challenges ahead of us. We are transiting to new rules to counter cyclicity, to decrease transfers from the national fund. The National Bank, in response to the increased inflation risks, started normalizing monetary policy, given the necessity for recovery growth of the economy. At the same time, we see that short-term measures, the stimulus and the programs that were launched in 2020, the effect will be limited. In this respect, we need to create long-term conditions for growth. In these conditions, we need to provide structural reforms. For these reforms were announced, and these structural reforms on increasing the role of the private sector, on attracting investment, on the increase of performance of the economy. The digitization gives us opportunity to accelerate all these reforms. If we talk about the banking sector, we were able to resolve the issue of historical problems of the last 10 years after the 2008 and 2009 problem. The banking sector emerged sustainable and strong with a great liquidity reserve, with the digital capabilities, which will allow the financial market to start on a new phase on the growth of the sector itself. Given that the National Bank is withdrawing from state programs, there will be a budget consolidation. The role of the financial sector is growing significantly. From the regulator's standpoint, they will need to create conditions to create balanced regulation. Also, measures will be taken for balanced regulation to increase competitiveness in the banking sector. At the same time, the main focus in regulation will be provided by protecting consumers. Thank you very much. This session indeed showed us some new opportunities and prospects, and also summed up macroeconomic policy discussions. I think we are wrapping up now. I would like to thank once again the participants.